Hello and welcome to TRIGGERnometry. I'm Francis Foster.
I'm Konstantin Kisin.
And this is the show for you if you're bored of people arguing on the internet over subjects they know nothing about. At TRIGGERnometry, we don't pretend to be the experts, we ask the experts.
So what can you tell us about the impact of the differences between men and women on things like the real world stuff, like the gender pay gap, for example?
This talk wasn't recorded. I probably should record it at some point, but I gave a talk for the Adam Smith Institute back in December, and I talked a little bit about where this kind of wage gap comes from. And I hope I get all the details of the study right, but they were looking at people who scored very high on quantitative measures like the SAT, men and women who scored very, very high, and they were looking at this kind of elite intellectual group. And they asked the men and the women in this group, how many hours a week would you work optimally if you were, if you had your druthers, which I don't know what druthers are, but they're a thing that you can have. And so if you had your druthers, how many hours a week would you work? And I think far fewer women, it's like 30 or 40% fewer women, said that they would work more than 40 hours a week. And so if you ask women, I think this is the major difference here. If you ask women, how much would you like to work in a week, and how much time would you like to spend with your family, and how much time would you like to spend with your kids, women say on average, I would like to spend more time with my family and my kids and less time working than men say that they would like to. And so that's kind of it's not very well appreciated, but I do think it comes down a lot to personal preferences. And men are also more willing to kind of work on call. There was this study that was done which showed that Uber drivers, like men, were making 9% more as Uber drivers than women were because they were willing to work more when the surge came. They were willing to make more short trips. They were essentially showing that they were more willing to take risks and do jobs that were less appealing. Another really interesting thing about men and women in terms of the pay domain is that lesbians make more than straight women do. There's something called the lesbian wage premium.
Lesbian privilege. That's what it is.
Yeah.
And lesbians make 9% more than straight women do. And if you were kind of going with the kind of typical story and you said, okay, well, lesbians obviously don't present as gender typical. They often come across as more butch, obviously. I think everybody knows that. Yeah.
Not on the internet. Not on the internet.
Yeah, that's the sound of a meltdown happening.
This idea like, women are assertive and they act, and I think that this is true to some extent, that women who act assertive, they're called bitches, in whatever American black slang. You say a man who acts dominant, he's bossed up, whereas a woman who acts dominant is called a bitch, right? I do think that happens, but you would think that a woman who didn't act in a gender-typical manner, like some lesbians do, would make less money because they would be oppressed for not fitting in with the larger gender roles. But no, they make more money. And I think it's because lesbians have some of these characteristics, like status-seeking, risk-taking kind of behavior, that more feminine straight women are less likely to have.
You've recently released a video, Jonathan Pye has, where you're talking about the gender pay gap, and it called widespread outrage, I think is the right word to use.
Well, it depends on who you look at. I mean, it followed off the back of the video we did about the Nazi pug, which I think probably caused more outrage. It was unfortunate because we'd written the video a few weeks before that. It just so happened that the pug thing happened, and then we had to release this at this time because it was ready to go, and it looked like we were being deliberately provocative doing two consecutive pieces like that. But
because that was the narrative, actually, it has been, isn't it? Like, you've gone all right. Like, Jonathan Pye has gone all right.
Sure. Yeah.
But he's actually been criticizing the left for ages. I mean, hasn't he? You both. I mean, you have, the two of you together.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you're familiar with the back catalogue, Jonathan Pye is a lefty who bashes the Tories more than anyone else. The Tories and Trump more than anyone else. So, I mean, if you're going to pick out these few videos where he does attack the left for where the left is going wrong because he cares about where the left is going wrong. So that makes sense to me. But the trouble is, I suppose, that the videos that cause contention are the ones that people remember or know about, and maybe they don't watch all of the other ones, so they don't get that perspective, perhaps. I don't know.
So on the gender pay gap, you made a video where Jonathan Pye interviews what he thinks is a feminist academic who's releasing a book. and he's asking her, expecting her to provide the usual narrative about the gender pay gap.
Right, exactly.
And what he encounters and very quickly gets frustrated by is that she's more of a second-wave feminist than a third-wave feminist. In
That's
other
exactly
words,
right.
she's not into the whole victimhood thing that's now so popular, which is what you've been talking about.
Right, so it's a satire on the media as well. The media have an expectation of a certain narrative that they have to produce, and then when they're confronted with something they're not familiar with, they don't know what to do. So it's a satirical piece.
Yeah.
I
And
think.
what was the response to that?
Okay, so
Deep breath.
some people weren't.
I'm
weren't
loving the
happy.
body language.
Yeah, I know. Some people weren't. I sort of stayed out of this one quite a bit when people started attacking us on Twitter. But yes, there was a bit of a backlash from certain feminist groups and from certain feminist figures and comedians more than anything. I mean, I didn't get involved, but I am aware of lots of threads that appeared on Facebook in which I was described as an alt-right, anti-feminist, all the rest of it, because friends of mine keep sending me screenshots and say, look what these people are saying about you, and it's
Good to have friends, eh?
Yeah, they seem to take a certain delight in it as well.
it is odd. It's odd that for a start, a piece of fiction, a piece of satire can generate that kind of response. But it's also, I'm up for the debate. You know, if anyone wants to email me and say why I'm wrong, great, and we'll talk about it. I'm. And also, what was very interesting, on all these threads I saw, all these arguments, not once did anyone present a coherent counter-argument to any argument that was made in the video. Not once. It was just ad hominem. It was just, you're alt-right, you're anti-feminist. Well, I'm not. And I always called myself a feminist, always have. I worry now that to use the word means that, because the word is so currently being used to describe a kind of victim-centered feminism, whereas I believe feminism is about equality and empowerment. And unfortunately, that makes me an old-fashioned kind of feminist. But on the other hand, I shouldn't allow people to misappropriate the word. So in a sense, I should hold on to it. But so that's what we were. I mean, the character in that video is, as you say, a feminist who hates the fact, for instance, that the BBC have promoted an app for your phone that will help women to speak up in meetings. And we make the point that this is horribly patronising. I mean, some of my female friends found this the most disgusting thing, but it's hailed as the BBC as this really progressive, wonderful thing. I would say that victim-centered feminism, although the people who promote it are not, of course, misogynists, but the premise of it is misogynist. The premise of it is that women are weaker, need extra protection, and that's why I don't agree with it.
Well, the media concept of the gender pay, the way they present it, I don't think they would ever elaborate on it that way, but the way they present it is essentially for every pound that a man earns, a woman earns, whatever, 77, 83.
Cents in the States,
right.
pence, yeah.
That's the idea. And what you're saying is, what they're doing is essentially they're adding up all the earnings of men on average, they're adding up the earnings of women, averaging that and comparing the two, and that doesn't reflect things like choices, time off work, career choices, things like that, right?
That's definitely true, but even those statements, women are earning, X amount of pence to the pound or the dollar, those are just false. That is
really?
that's essentially implying a question of equal pay, right? Yeah. For every pound a man earns, a woman will earn X. No, that's not true. You then have to ask yourself, what is the circumstance? Because it could be that for every pound a woman earns who is a CEO at a bank, a man earns X percentage less, right? So, I think that statement in and of itself is extremely misleading, if not downright wrong. So let's look at the figures in the UK. The most popular statistic used, well, not necessarily most popular, but the one you'll see perhaps on the big media screens is 18.4%. That is the gender pay gap in the UK. That statistic's calculated by the Office for National Statistics, which does a really good job of calculating the pay gap. But that combines full-time workers and part-time workers. We know that women are significantly more likely to work part-time and that those jobs tend to pay less. So I think in and of itself, that is a really unfair calculation. You're not comparing like for like. If you just separate part-time workers from full-time workers. That's all you've done. You still have not taken into account age, job, background, children, anything. You get 9.1% pay gap for full-time workers, negative 5.1% pay gap for part-time workers. So that's a pay gap in favor of women.
So part-time workers who are female actually out-earn their male counterparts.
On average. Yes,
right.
Exactly. So just by doing that one thing, you've cut the pay gap in half for full-time, and you've actually shown that women are doing better on average in part-time work. So that just goes to show how manipulated these statistics can be when you just are taking one thing into account. Then when you start to go into age, start to go into background, the pay gap gets smaller and smaller and smaller. So in the UK, women between the ages of 22 to 39 are basically earning the same as men. The pay gap is negligible. In 2015, women aged 22 to 29 were earning slightly more, tiny percentage. Right now, men are earning 2%, 2.5% more. That's a negligible statistic. So, we can actually say that the gender pay gap has been eradicated for men and women between the ages of 20 and 40. That's a huge part of your working life. That's absolutely fantastic. I think the pay gap that still exists after that age has a lot to do with maternity leave and the fact that women take years off work on average compared to men. It has to do with a lot of choices that women are making in terms of jobs and work culture and what they value. It has a lot to do with whether or not you're willing to work overtime, willing to work weekends. That feeds into job culture and all that. None of those things, and the actual job that you choose to do, none of those things are calculated in the pay gap. So even the very basic statistics we have are showing a pretty good picture for women. The pay gap's the lowest it's ever been on record since they started calculating it in the UK. And that hasn't taken into account very important things.
So if that's the case, and you're saying that it's negligible, then why are we constantly getting bombarded with these facts and statistics about how women are being out-earned by men, we live in an unfair society, we live in a sexist society? Why are we getting that story?
Well, I have two theories. One's generous and one isn't. Which one do you want first?
Let's go both. Well,
Okay, I'll start. I think the generous one is that it's 2018. It's an important year. It's 100 women. 100 women? It's 100 years. It's 100 years since women got the vote in the UK. And something still doesn't feel quite right. As a woman in 2018, you still recognize that a lot of the cards are stacked against you. Look at domestic violence stats, look at rape statistics. Compare men and women walking home alone on any given evening. Women have their car keys in their fingers and men don't. Something still doesn't feel right. It doesn't seem fair. And I think that very legitimate feeling that we can all pretty much agree on, then people want to harness that and say, well, what are we going to do about it? And unfortunately, people go to the gender pay gap because they think it's something that they can really easily solve through legislation. They think, well, I want to see results. I want to get a law passed. I want to get something done. Let's focus on the gender pay gap because we can make the state, make big business publish their pay gap figures. We can do something and say we got a win, we got a policy win. But of course, that has no meaningful impact on the things that I think women are still actually facing and the disadvantages that we have in society. So, that would be my generous reading of it, that people just want to do something about the unfairness that they still see in the world. So they latch onto the pay gap, even though that's not where we need to be latching onto. If anything, we can say this seems to be going extremely well. There's still some things we could do to help women in work for sure, but this is not the major area. We need to look at violence. We need to look at Yarl's Wood Detention Center, where immigrant women are kept and detained and treated horribly. That's what we need to look at. My less generous reading is that, it's a lucrative and popular business to be promoting victimhood culture. And the larger the statistic, the more media attention you'll get. If you look at a lot of these articles across the spectrum, it's no particular publication. If EasyJet was a really good example when businesses had to publish their pay gap figures for the first time back in April. Every headline was EasyJet has 52% gender pay gap. Massive. You had to get to paragraph 6 or 7, if it was in the article at all, where it said, actually, the reason that they have this pay gap is that they pay their pilots $100,000 a year, they pay the stewards $25,000 a year, 6% of their pilots are women, 94% are men. This is double the worldwide average of female pilots. they're actually doing really well. They can't hire more female pilots because they don't exist. They implemented a program years back with their own profits off their own back to bring in more women by 2020. This is a company that is doing everything it can to encourage women, support women, and to pay them fairly and equally. And this is the reason for their pay gap. But that was not at the top of the article. That was, if you're lucky, at the bottom. So those big statistics sell. I think there's a real effort right now to press the reset button on the gender pay gap. It really wasn't that long ago, 40 years ago, where you could see a genuine pay gap that was based on discrimination, that women got paid less than men. And that has closed so dramatically for a lot of reasons, including the fact that women are getting better educated. They're more educated than men on average, and they're going on to do those top jobs. They're extremely motivated. There isn't that glass ceiling anymore. And, that pay gap has been shrinking and shrinking and shrinking, which is great news. It's a wonderful story to tell, especially young women. And a lot of these groups that do very well perpetuating that victimhood mentality need to press a reset button. They need to be able to say that something's still wrong here in order to have relevance. And they've been really successful. I mean, up until April, the pay gap, the biggest one you could come up with was 18.4%, but that's quite misleading. We've got this great story about 9.1%, negative 5.1%. And then they get these big businesses without much context at all to publish their pay gap statistics. And now they can say 52% gender pay gap, 70% gender pay gap. It's as if, the past 50 years didn't exist. And that's great for them. It's a really bad message for normal women who are just going to work in the morning, pouring a cup of coffee, now thinking to themselves, oh, I work for EasyJet. Are they discriminating against me? No. They want to perpetuate you. They want to bring you up. They want to propel you to top spots, actually. But if you just read the headline, a lot of people do, you're going to have a pretty negative attitude. So that's my slightly more skeptical perspective. I think they're trying to push the reset button to make this issue still relevant. I think it's really terrible for young women, especially, to see this.
So the gender pay gap, I think, is a really, really good example of how statistics can be used to prove anything that you want them to prove at all, because it all depends on what we measure. So if you want to make the gender pay gap seem massive, then what you do is you look at the earnings of all men and the earnings of all women, and you compare them with each other, and surprise, surprise, you find out that women earn less than men. But obviously what that's not taking into account is the hours that men and women work, the jobs that men and women do, and this fact that we've already mentioned, in the past, men and women weren't as equal as they are today. So if you look at the top rungs of careers where people have been working for 30, 40 years, they've reached the absolute top of their profession, you are more likely to find men in those positions. So if you do that, you take all men's wages, all women's wages, you find a very, very big gender pay gap. But basically, the more we compare like for like, so the more you look at men and women doing the same jobs for the same number of hours, for the same level of experience, then the pay gap gets narrower and narrower and narrower, and eventually, comparing like for like, it disappears altogether. There's no gender pay gap if you look at men and women who are both doing the same job, same length of time, same number of hours each week. And of course, that's the case. I mean, you just think about this for like a minute or two, because for one thing, it's illegal. So if you took two people who are doing the exact same job, exact same hours, exact same level, and the man was being paid more, the woman could take this company, the boss, to court. It would be illegal. They would be breaking the law. But there's an even more common sense argument as well. If bosses could get away with paying women substantially less for doing the exact same work as men do, but just cheaper, why would any boss anywhere ever employ a man? Why would you get a man to do the job?
Well, it's interesting that you say that, because we're recording this, and by the time this goes out, it will be a couple of weeks from today, probably. The guest whose episode we've just released is a lady called Dr. Pippa Malmgren, who's a good friend and a wonderful person. She is a former advisor to an American president, founder of her own company, etc. And when we talked to her, we asked her about the pay gap as well. And she said that as a speaker, after her political career and all the rest of it, she actually had her own agent, speaking agent, say to her, your metrics are great, you're getting better performances than your male counterparts, but we cannot get you the same fees because you're a woman. So there is some. I mean, not everyone is rational. Not everyone. I mean, you say it's illegal, and it is, but people do illegal stuff all the time, right? So there's probably a small element of discrimination that is part of what causes the gender pay gap. But I totally hear your argument about these averages being useless, essentially, in measuring the real gender pay gap. But so my question, you think there's no discrimination against women at all in the workplace?
Well, I tell you what, I mean, I don't know the woman who you've just interviewed, and I'm really looking forward to.
I'll send you the episode,
I'll watch that interview with great interest. But I mean, some personal advice from me to her, you know, and I'm sure she probably won't watch and won't appreciate this, but if I was her, I'd sack that
That's
agent.
exactly what she did. Well, Pippa's great. She's not someone who would whine or complain. She took action.
Sack that agent, get yourself another agent.
But my point is, she's a very, very accomplished, very powerful person who's made a great success of her life. Not every person is. I'm not as accomplished or successful, and I'm, you know, so there. Not everyone is capable necessarily of that. Not everyone is in a position where their value is so high that they can do that.
Definitely. Well, I think there's a couple of things to say here. I mean, for one thing, I think that when we compare, I mean, so we hear on the news, you know, about women who work at the BBC being paid a lot less than men. So there was even a story about Martina Navratilova when she was doing the commentary at the Wimbledon at the tennis, being paid less than John McEnroe, John McEnroe, doing likewise doing coverage of Wimbledon. But then you stop and you look at this, you know, McEnroe was a much bigger personality. He was the one who was fronting the BBC's coverage. He was doing 10 times as much of the live broadcasts as Navratilova was. So again, you just were not comparing like for like. And the way the story appears is like, oh, poor Martina Navratilova, isn't it terrible? All this discrimination. So we had another story about Claire Foy and Matt Smith in The Crown. You know, Claire Foy was being paid less than Matt Smith. Isn't this terrible? She was in the lead role, etc., etc. Apart from before The Crown, who had heard of Claire Foy? You know, not me, whereas Matt Smith had been Doctor Who. So when we talk about speakers, celebrities, sports stars, their salaries are not worked out in the same way. I mean, if you are working in McDonald's and you say, oh, you know, actually, I'd like to negotiate a bit of a pay rise here.
Good luck with that.
They show you the door, you know. Yeah. But this is not to say that I don't think there's any truth in what you're saying. I do think that there's perhaps a confidence issue for women where they are less likely to push themselves forward, perhaps undervalue themselves. You know, I've certainly been in cases, particularly when I speak at American universities, and they'll ask me, well, what's your going rate? And I'm like, oh my God, I have no idea how to answer this question. And the fear is, my fear is you pitch yourself too high, they're going to say no thank you and laugh, and you know, end up underselling myself as a result. But do you know what? I think feminism today doesn't help women with that confidence problem. I think the more we hear it's so shit being a woman, it's so awful, the more you do then begin to undervalue yourself. You think then when people undervalue you, you think, oh yes, this is just what life's like for being a woman, because it's really awful and terrible. So I think the best thing feminism could do for women would be to say, actually, there's loads of opportunities out there. Never been a better time to be a woman. Get out there, take advantage of all these opportunities. Don't sit at home underselling yourself.
If you've enjoyed this week, as always, follow us on at TriggerPod on Twitter, Instagram. We're on Facebook as well. I'm Konstantin Kishin. You can find me on Twitter at Konstantin Kishin.
I'm Francis Foster. You can find me on Twitter at FailingHuman. Send me abuse as well. Mostly people just do it about my face. But if you've enjoyed it, please give us a rating, 5 stars. Say something nice. Tell a friend about it. We are on iTunes. We are on, what's the new one, the Pocket one?
Pocket Cast, I think.
Is it Pocket Cast?
We'll get on that. Pocket Cast?
Yeah.
Our producer doesn't know either. We're screwed.
Yeah, he's just looking at us blankly.
Subscribe to our YouTube channel. We're building up our audience, and we'll be back next week with another episode. Thanks very much.
And you need to up your game for next week. Right, I'll see you soon. Thanks, bye.